12th of August 1935, Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Aizawa of the Imperial Japanese Army strode purposefully into the Tokyo office of Lieutenant General Tetsuya Nagata, the chief of the Army's Military Affairs Bureau and the de facto leader of the Control Faction, a relatively moderate clique of officers within the army that vied for influence with the more radical and expansionist Imperial Way faction, to which Aizawa bore his allegiance. Before the general even acknowledged his presence, Aizawa unsheathed his sword and lunged at the general, missing him on the first strike and only slightly wounding him on the second. However, as the general staggered away in a futile attempt to escape, Aizawa finally plunged his sword deep into the man's back and impaled him against the door, after which he slashed his neck twice for good measure. Upon completing this brutal assassination, Aizawa casually walked to the office of a colleague, whereupon he proclaimed that he had just dealt out heaven's justice. And then he went off to buy a cap, since he had lost his while murdering one of the country's most senior generals. Aizawa's attitude was so nonchalant that he sincerely thought that he wouldn't be charged with a crime. When he was later apprehended by a military policeman, he thought that he would be briefly interrogated and then allowed to return to duty. This grisly story would seem totally bizarre in almost any other context, but for 1930s Japan, it was a mere footnote in a long list of politically motivated murders carried out by ultranationalist groups, mostly comprised of young officers in the army and the navy. And while there's nothing particularly strange about political killings, especially at a time when other far-right groups the world over were also making use of such means, what makes interwar Japan's experience with this sort of violence so unique is the main demographic of its victims: prominent members of the nation's ruling class. Generals, admirals, close advisors to the emperor, even prime ministers were all fair game to the bloodthirsty would-be insurrectionists that pervaded the Japanese military through most of the interwar period. And all of these disgruntled extremists shared a common overarching goal: to rid Japan of the leaders that they saw as weak and corrupt, who in their mind bore responsibility for the country's mounting economic problems, had made far too many concessions to the Western powers, and most importantly, had prevented Japan from realizing its destiny as an expansionist empire. Before looking at their many vicious attempts at achieving this goal, it's important first to understand some of the historical context that these actions took place in, specifically the domestic and international factors that motivated them. By the dawn of the 1930s, Japan's economy wasn't in great shape. The Great Depression was taking a heavy toll on the country, particularly on its dwindling agricultural sector, impoverishing many rural areas as a result, which happened to be where the army drew most of their recruits from. The poverty back home was contrasted by many young officers with the vast wealth of the Zaibatsu, massive corporations that were viewed as being in bed with the politicians, a distinction that served to radicalize them against a ruling class that they thought were selling out the Japanese people. In the same vein, these young officers found the ruling class's dealings with the West to be further proof of their unpatriotic ways. The 1930 London Naval Treaty, for example, epitomized their concerns, the agreement having precluded Japan from gaining parity with the British and American fleets. Nevertheless, these factors alone don't account for why so many in the Japanese military were more than willing to take matters into their own hands to overthrow civilian government. That can only be fully explained with reference to a uniquely Japanese phenomenon: Gekkokujo, a concept that roughly translates to overthrowing or surpassing one's superiors. Gekkokujo was practically a character trait of the Imperial Japanese Army during this period, with officers of varying ranks routinely defying orders from higher command or the civilian government in Tokyo, and many of them even concocted their own adventurous schemes completely independent of the chain of command. Perhaps the best way of illustrating this tendency is by recalling the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The invasion was nominally carried out by the Japanese state, but in practical terms, the invasion came about due to the actions of just two officers in the Kwantung Army, an army group stationed in Japan's mainland Chinese territory. In September 1931, Colonel Seishiro Itagaki and Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishiwara responded to a false flag bombing in Mukden that they had staged by ordering all of the troops under their command to invade and occupy Manchuria, without informing either the Kwantung Army Command or the civilian government in Tokyo. The Kwantung Army quickly decided to go along with this impromptu invasion, but the government was dismayed at how such an unprovoked act of aggression would affect Japan's international relations. The cabinet ordered the Army General Staff, who in turn ordered the Kwantung Army, to scale back hostilities. However, they simply ignored the command and before long had occupied the whole of Manchuria. So, what happened then to the two insubordinate officers who had conquered an entire territory against the explicit orders of their own government? Well, Colonel Ishiwara very soon became General Ishiwara, and as for Itagaki, he was later appointed as the Kwantung Army Chief of Staff, and he eventually went on to become the War Minister. So it's not exactly hard to understand why so many in the Japanese military were so unapprehensive about the thought of open rebellion. The first of these instances materialized in March 1931, when the Cherry Society, a small sect of ultranationalist army officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Kingiro Hashimoto, tried to foment a large riot in Tokyo so that the army, under the lead of War Minister Kazushige Ugaki, would step in and declare martial law. The idea was that Ugaki and the army hierarchy would then seize the opportunity to install a military government. The plan didn't get very far though on account of Ugaki's reluctance to potentially jeopardize his political career, and the fact that Hashimoto couldn't actually bring together any sort of substantial crowd to do the rioting. He and other officers were soon arrested for their involvement in the plot, but were all handed down extraordinarily light sentences. Light enough that Hashimoto was back in the army and ready to launch another coup just 7 months later. By October of the same year, Hashimoto had brewed up a plot even more extreme than the last. With the pledged support of 120 army officers and their troops, Hashimoto was intent on assassinating a plethora of political figures, occupying the centres of government power in Tokyo, and ordaining Imperial Way faction leader General Sato Araki as the new Prime Minister. Once again, however, Hashimoto's coup never made it past the planning stage, as a leak from the inside found its way to the new War Minister Jiro Minami. Rather than immediately arrest Hashimoto, he gave General Araki the chance to persuade him from going through with it. Hashimoto refused to be talked out of it though, which forced Araki to order his arrest. And if Hashimoto didn't learn his lesson the first time round, it's extremely surprising that he did on the second. He was sentenced to just 20 days of house arrest for his part, after which he was allowed to again rejoin the army. Inspired and emboldened by Hashimoto's previous efforts, two high-profile assassinations came about at the beginning of 1932, when two members of a group that later became known as the League of Blood decided to act upon their initiate pledge to kill at least one political or financial leader. On February 9th, former Finance Minister Junosuke Inoue, who while in office had opposed increases in army spending, was gunned down in broad daylight. This was followed by the equally brazen murder of Takuma Dan, the head of Mitsui and one of Japan's leading industrialists, about a month later. After a lengthy trial that drew enormous media attention and evoked considerable public sympathy for the murderers among the general population, the two men and the group's leader were sentenced to life imprisonment, being spared the death penalty. However, the judge himself expressed hope that the three men would be soon released by way of an imperial amnesty. His wish later came to pass in 1940, the men being released having served only 6 years of their sentence. Just 2 months after the second League of Blood killing, a small band of similarly incensed naval officers, army cadets, and civilians put their plans for rebellion into action, in what was supposed to be a coup attempt, but which fizzled out into nothing but another gruesome political murder. On May 15th, 9 of these army and naval troops drove to the residence of Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyoshi. Upon arriving, they killed the bodyguard and forced their way into the house, where they soon found the 76-year-old Inokai, shooting him twice and leaving him for dead. The group did have an elaborate plan mapped out for after the assassination that they hoped would prompt martial law to be declared and a military government to be instated. However, this didn't quite work out. Their efforts to plunge Tokyo into chaos didn't amount to anything more than firing some rounds and tossing a few grenades at government and financial buildings. And most of the conspirators voluntarily surrendered to military police shortly after, whereupon the chief of the military police, General Shinji, ordered that they be treated as patriots. And so they were. Trials of the conspirators were so lenient that the army cadets involved had their charges dropped from murder to rebellion, and each were given only a 4-year sentence. The next few years in Japan were pretty quiet as far as political violence goes. There were a couple of conspiracies within the army's ranks during this time, but they were all expediently suppressed before those involved could take any action. Unsurprisingly, none of the conspirators received anything more than a slap on the wrist for planning to violently depose the government. Nevertheless, these norms of treating coup plotters and murderers with a light hand, so long as their deeds were committed in the emperor's name, were about to come to an end. By the beginning of 1936, yet another plot by discontented army officers was in the making. This military uprising was to be the largest and most ambitious that Japan had seen in its history as a modern nation. And this time, the Japanese elite could not afford to simply brush it off as another misguided act of patriotism. On the snowy morning of February 26, 1936, a group of army officers amassed a total of 1,500 soldiers and began converging on the centre of Tokyo, making their way to 6 different targets within the city that would be attacked simultaneously. The bulk of the forces were sent to Tokyo Metropolitan Police Headquarters, the Ministry of War, and the residences of political leaders, including the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and close advisors to the Emperor. At the Ministry of War, the rebels read their demands to War Minister Yoshiyuki Kawashima. They wanted political and social reforms, the arrest of leaders of the Control faction, the assignment of Imperial Way faction officers to key positions within the army, a declaration of martial law, and the appointment of the sympathetic General Mazaki as Prime Minister. Above all, though, the rebels yearned for a show of restoration, whereby all pretenses of democracy would be dropped and the Emperor would effectively become an absolute monarch. While the rebels at the Ministry of War were busy coercing the War Minister to bring their demands directly to the Emperor, the other troops were getting to work on another objective of their coup, killing 7 of Japan's most powerful figures. Despite attempts to carry out all 7 murders, only 3 of the targets were killed. Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo and Lord Keeper of the Privy Seals Saito Makoto, who both happened to be former Prime Ministers, as well as the Inspector General of Military Training Jotaro Watanabe, all met a gruesome end that morning at the hands of rebel troops. One man in particular, however, was very lucky to survive the coup. Prime Minister Keisuke Okada, who the rebels had sent almost 300 troops to surround his residence, eventually managed to escape unscathed after a harrowing 2-day ordeal. When the troops made it into his house following a brief gunfight with police, they soon came upon Okada's brother-in-law, Denzo Matsuo, who bore a passing resemblance to the Prime Minister. Matsuo was quickly gunned down, and the commanding officer, comparing the body to a photograph of Okada, was confident that they had just killed him. Okada, meanwhile, hid in the house, holding himself up in a closet under a pile of laundry, until the next day when he was smuggled out of the rebel-guarded house with the help of his secretaries and a few loyal military policemen. Once he escaped, he was eventually able to find refuge for the remainder of the incident in the Imperial Palace. As all of this was taking place, the rebel troops took up positions throughout the government district of Tokyo, anxiously awaiting the outcome of their coup attempt. War Minister Kawashima did meet with the Emperor shortly after he was visited by the rebel officers, and he presented their grievances to him. The Emperor was deeply displeased with the rebellion, understandable given that his foremost advisors had been on the rebels' hit list, and he wanted the army to quash it. That was, however, a lot easier said than done. You see, many in the army leadership actually agreed with the rebels in principle, and while none were willing to take a definitive stand in support of them, they were also reluctant to use force to bring the rebellion to an end. In fact, negotiations between the rebels and Army High Command were so conciliatory that the rebels interpreted it as a sign of their endorsement of the coup. It took a personal intervention from the emperor himself, something which was almost unheard of during Hirohito's reign, to force the army leadership's hand. On the morning of February 28th, the emperor declared that if the army cannot subdue the rebels, I will go out and dissuade them myself, which compelled the army to issue an edict in the emperor's name, ordering the rebels to withdraw from their positions by 8 AM the following morning. If they did not comply, they would be fired on as traitors. And by this point, the rebels were completely encircled by over 20,000 government troops and 22 tanks. The Navy had also moved 40 warships into Tokyo Bay with their guns trained on the rebels' positions, many of its officers feeling outraged that 3 former admirals had been marked for death by an army rebellion. Realizing the futility of continued resistance now that both the emperor and the military were firmly against them, all enlisted men abandoned their posts, and the February 26th incident came to a conclusion. As for the officers who orchestrated the rebellion, they were left alone for some time by government troops in order to give them a chance to commit seppuku. But they instead chose to submit themselves to a court-martial, where they hoped to emulate the trials of the coup plotters that came before them, a nationwide stage to voice their ideas, and a light sentence at the end of it. What they got, however, was the exact opposite. The trials were held behind closed doors, and within the space of months, almost all of the officers were sentenced to death. The days of political killings and open rebellion going without serious punishment were finally over. Despite the coup's failure, it did have several important ramifications for Japanese politics. Prime Minister Okada's government ended up resigning just 2 weeks after the incident, paving the way for a new cabinet under Okada's former foreign minister Koki Hirota, who soon acquiesced to a number of the army's political demands. Most notably, Hirota accepted an army proposal that all future war ministers should be active duty officers as well as be approved by army leadership. This was essentially the final nail in the coffin for civilian government in Imperial Japan. If the military disapproved of a cabinet, the war minister could resign and the army leadership would simply refuse to approve anyone else, thereby bringing about the fall of the cabinet. The army could then refuse to provide a minister until a cabinet to their liking was selected. Government policy was now enacted at the military's pleasure, and although Japan's period of government by assassination was finally brought to a close, a new era of renewed imperialist expansion into China was about to begin.